So we left off talking about the flow of energy, right? We identified metabolism as one of the characteristics for life. All living things must undergo metabolic activity, and we're clear that this term metabolism refers to all of the chemical reactions that go on in an organism. Our bodies are constantly undergoing chemical reactions all day, and so what we understand is that there is a need for energy to fuel these reactions. So we left off highlighting or discussing how this energy flows through ecosystems, right? So we're clear that the sun is the major source of energy, and energy from the sun is passed down to producers. Producers such as these green photosynthetic plants utilize energy from the sun in order to produce food and energy. And then that energy is passed over to consumers and decomposers. So this is where we receive our, how we receive our energy. And we started talking about the process of cellular respiration. So I showed you this schematic of an energy pyramid, which again just illustrates how energy from the sun is passed down to producers, and then producers become a source of food for organisms in various trophic levels above it. So we have different categories of consumers, right? We have our primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary. All right, so you should be familiar with this energy pyramid. We defined this term producer. Another word for producers are autotrophs, because these are organisms that can produce their own foods. Okay, examples included plants, algae, and some bacteria. Okay. Conversely, consumers of energy are also known as heterotrophs, okay? These are organisms that cannot make their own foods, but they must eat, okay? They must consume food in order to have energy production. So these are just some various examples of consumers, all right? You have varying classifications of consumers based on an organism's food preference. So we have our herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, and so forth, okay? So this information you already have in your notes. And again, this was just another schematic to wrap up what we talked about here, how energy flows from the sun down to producers, okay, and over to consumers, all right? Consumers must eat things, okay? That's gonna include animals, and we're also in this category. We're eating things in order to get the energy that we need. So one point that I left off and without making was that this transfer of energy through ecosystem is not a completely efficient process, okay? There is a loss of energy during this energy transfer process from one trophic level to the next, okay? So there is in fact a 10% energy transfer from one trophic level to the next, all right? So from producers down to consumers, there is not a 100% efficient process of transfer, all right? This energy is going to be lost in the form of heat, all right? So that is a point that we should note, that this is not a completely efficient process. Okay. So let's look at these two reactions here where plants are using energy from the sun in order to make their own foods. Okay, that process is known as photosynthesis. All right, I'm sure this isn't your first time hearing about photosynthesis, but by definition, photosynthesis is a process in which autotrophs use light energy from the sun to make sugar in the form of glucose, and then oxygen is also released. All right, and the reactants here are carbon dioxide and water. All right, so you should be familiar with what's happening in this reaction for photosynthesis. All right, so carbon dioxide and water are our reactants. All right, oxygen and glucose are formed, and this is done with the use of sunlight energy. So let's look at what this is. Just another schematic again for those of us that are visual. You know that plants utilize carbon dioxide, which is in the atmosphere, and water is required for plant growth, and this sunlight energy is used to produce glucose and oxygen. So this is the very simple chemical equation for photosynthesis. Go ahead and write this down in your notes. You should be able to readily identify this simplified representation of what's happening during photosynthesis, okay? This is a chemical equation. If you've never seen a chemical equation before, we use chemical equations to represent what's happening in a chemical reaction, okay? In this case, this reaction demonstrates represents photosynthesis. Okay, so our reactants here are carbon dioxide and water, okay, in the presence of energy from the sun, right, producing glucose and oxygen. Jot down this simple equation. You should be able to readily identify it, as well as the reactants and products that are being made. Okay, this process takes place in the chloroplast of plants. We know that this is a very unique structure in plants that we don't find in animals. And this chlorophyll pigment right here helps to capture that sunlight energy. All right, we don't mix up chlorophyll and chloroplast. Chloroplast is an organelle. Chlorophyll here is a green pigment that's found in plants. All right, so plants are using energy from the sun to undergo photosynthesis to produce their own foods. However, animals cannot use that same process. All right, so there's a different process that we use in order to release energy into our bodies, and that process is called cellular respiration. All right, jot this down. Okay, don't mix this up with the respiration. You probably hear about the term respiration, which means to breathe. Right, cellular respiration is a different process here. We're talking about how do we produce or generate energy. Okay, cellular respiration is the process that animals use to obtain energy from stored molecules. Where are these molecules? These are the carbohydrates in the foods that we eat, right? We know that carbs are one of our four biological molecules or macromolecules that we are requiring in order to be alive. We'll talk about them in detail in another chapter, but if you remember from your high school class, some macromolecules, there are four: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, right? These carbohydrates are super important in our bodies as they are the major source of energy for us, okay? And so again, what's our backstory here? The backstory is that this energy that we're generating through cellular respiration fuels these metabolic processes and biological processes that go on in our bodies all day long. They require energy, right? So energy and metabolism is absolutely a requirement for life, right? So all of those other characteristics that we highlighted, 1 through 8, you know, maintaining homeostasis, responding to stimuli, reproduction, all of those require energy. Okay, so if we don't have this energy available to fuel these processes, then we're going to compromise a lot of things. All right, so you should understand sort of this bigger picture here of why energy is important for life. It's required to fuel all of these metabolic activities that we undergo every day. So what's happening during cellular respiration? Okay, during cellular respiration, the carbohydrates that we eat and the oxygen that we breathe in, right, from the atmosphere is used as reactants now in cellular respiration. And you know that our bodies produce carbon dioxide and water as a byproduct, and energy will be released, right? And so again, the point we're making here is that our bodies, our cells, utilize energy stored in glucose that's made available through these chemical reactions. We have to break this food down, right, to release the energy that's trapped in these carbohydrate molecules. All right, so you do need to know the reactants and products again in this reaction, right? So this is a little bit different than photosynthesis. All right, we've got some different reactants, we've got some different products. Okay, so the reactants here are the parts of the equation where we're going to see a transformation and new products will be made. All right. So we start with glucose in the foods that we eat, the carbohydrates, right? We start with oxygen that we're breathing in, right? So those glucose and oxygen are broken down to release carbon dioxide, water, and therefore energy. All right. So look at this illustration right here. It's a great schematic of what's happening during cellular respiration. Okay, our bodies have to break down the foods that we eat, right? It should come a little bit more intuitive to you now as you see this picture. As you know, we must breathe in air, we must consume food, okay? And you know that we breathe out carbon dioxide and water is produced in the process and energy is released into our bodies when we eat, okay? Questions? What questions do we have? Awesome. So if we were to put these equations side by side, you would notice that there are 4 reactants in products, or 4 reactants that align themselves differently depending on the reaction. So in photosynthesis here, if we just look at this top portion and we're going from left to right, we have photosynthesis being represented by carbon dioxide and water. Okay, in the presence of energy from the sun will yield glucose and oxygen. This is what's happening during photosynthesis. Okay, this process takes place in plants, algae, and some bacteria. All right, on the other hand, we see these same reactants, but our reaction is going to look a little bit different here for cellular respiration. Same components, different reaction. For cellular respiration, we're moving from right to left. Okay, from right to left, we have oxygen and glucose as our reactants. Okay, and then water and carbon dioxide are produced as a byproduct, as well as energy being released in the form of ATP. This is what happens during cellular respiration. You should certainly be able to identify these 2 equations. You should be able to accurately delineate where each component is in the reaction and what's happening. Okay. And you should be able to describe for me why these 2 processes are important in living things. Okay. All right, so that's energy. Okay, so the checkpoint question here, I want you to think for just one moment. Why would you get tired if you did not eat enough sugar or breathe enough air? Right, so I showed you a little illustration here a few seconds ago. This one. All right, so we're taking in oxygen, we're eating our foods, and we get energy or whatever. So somebody explain to me, why do you get tired if you don't eat enough, or if you're not obtaining enough oxygen?
Because you won't have enough energy.
Right. So what's actually happening? So what's the evidence that you don't have enough energy? Like, how do we know? What process is going to be affected if you don't eat enough?
Because your sugars
are needed for cellular respiration.
Right. So what's going to happen here is that you feel, if you go all day without eating, you are going to feel kind of tired and lethargic, right? Because your body doesn't have anything to work with. Okay. That major source of energy is in those carbohydrates, in the foods that we eat. So if you go all day without eating, you are going to feel sort of sluggish. Okay. Now your bodies will attempt to, if in the absence of those carbohydrates, your body will try and go and break down fat. Okay. But that's a different process. Your body prefers glucose as its major energy source. Okay. So if you don't get enough foods, you're not getting enough air, you're gonna feel tired, you're gonna feel lethargic, you're not going to have energy, because the reactants that are necessary for cellular respiration to occur are not plentiful. Okay. Cellular respiration is the process by which our bodies break down the foods that we're eating, okay, in order to release energy into our bodies. All right, so do go back and read that. We're still in chapter 1, section 1.2, I think is where you'll find that information. All right, so let's expand our conversation just a little bit into one of our final requirements for life, and that was adaptation and evolution. What is evolution? When you hear evolution, what comes to mind?
When things grow. A new generation of life forming.
Okay. All right. A new generation of life forming. And so where's that new life form coming from? I like that.
Is it like genetics?
Okay. Genetics. Elaborate a little bit. Somebody chime in and help her. Like where's this new life evolving from? Somebody else. What is evolution?
Oh, it can also come from adaptation.
Right.
From a different environment.
Okay. All right, so that's where we want to go here. We want to look and see then how, so this concept of evolution refers to some change that's occurring, right? You're seeing changes in the characteristics of an individual or an organism over time, right? This process of evolution is something that happens, and the young lady, you did hit it, the nail on the head. It's due to genetics, it's due to heredity, right? We talked about that transfer of information from parent to offspring. So this process of evolution, these changes that we see over time from generation to generation, is due to the actual genetic material that we are inheriting. Okay, so the changes in your DNA are responsible for us continuing to evolve as a species. Okay, so let's look at this concept of evolution. Okay, by definition, jot this down. We'll say that evolution is the process by which populations of organisms change over time. Okay, and so what's happening is that you're inheriting these genes for new traits that are being passed down from one generation to the next. Okay, and these changes that we see are these new genes that we're inheriting, these new traits, these new alleles are responsible for the differences that we see in populations over time. Okay, if we studied populations from a historical perspective, we would be able to see genetic changes over time. Okay, and so this is a very strong concept. All right, you know, for the purpose of this class, we understand that evidence suggests that we have all evolved from a common ancestor. Okay, jot this down. There's evidence that suggests that the first life forms on Earth were prokaryotic organisms, right? But of course, we're not prokaryotic organisms. We are eukaryotic organisms. Okay, so over time, there has been an evolution. Okay, change has occurred from the very first evidence of life forms to the many diverse life forms that we see around us from day to day. All right, so again, this is in no way an attempt to step on any of your personal beliefs, but from a science perspective, we study evolution in the context of, you know, early life forms into what we see now. Okay, and you should understand and be able to discuss this evolutionary theory that we have all arrived from a common ancestor, being a single prokaryotic organism. Okay, make a note of that. Read a little bit more about that in your text. Okay, and so the point we're making here is that this change, right, evolution is referring to change over time. The change is due to the transmission of genetic information. That's what we're understanding here, right? And these changes in genetic information, these new sets of genes that we continue to inherit from one generation to the next, that was passed down from your great grandparents to your grandparents, from your grandparents to your actual parents, and then from your parents to you. All of these genetic changes that we're inheriting are providing us with the survival advantages that we need. Okay, so these changes are good. All right, so that's the extent to which we'll discuss evolution for now. All right, so what questions do you all have about that? Okay, so what I want you to be able to discuss just at this point, as we are right now in chapter 1, is just that, what is evolution? What is its connection to us being able to define this set of characteristics of life? Okay, adaptation and evolution is absolutely essential for an organism to continue to be alive. Okay, if an organism loses its ability to continue to adapt and evolve to its surroundings, it will not survive. Okay, and so you should be able to intelligently discuss that for me. All right, so the last topic for this chapter is classification, right? So with evolution and the discovery of new organisms, we have to be able to name and classify all these new organisms that we're discovering. Okay. Does anyone know what do we call the branch of science that deals with naming and classifying organisms? What is that branch of science called? Can anyone remember? All right. Taxonomy. Write down the word taxonomy. I'm sorry? Write down the term taxonomy. Mute your mics, please. Mute your mics. So taxonomy, we're going to define taxonomy as the branch of biology that deals with classifying and naming organisms. Okay, taxonomy is a very important branch of biology as we study life. Again, as scientists all across the globe are continuing to investigate and discover new organisms, right? We had to come up with sort of a uniform way for classifying and naming these organisms. Okay, so how do we do that? So scientists identify and classify organisms by looking at similarities and differences amongst various organisms. Okay, there are categories of inclusion criteria to delineate an organism to a specific domain, kingdom, phylum, class. You've probably at least seen the hierarchy of classification from domain all the way down to species, right? So we're looking for similarities from a structural and functional standpoint amongst these organisms, right? So if you and I were to go outside of Carter Hall, outside of the science building, and go and dig in the soil and find this organism, this weird organism that we've never seen before, and we want to know how to classify it, we're going to start looking for very specific features. Okay, we're looking for similarities to other organisms that have already been identified. Okay, but in addition to looking for like the similarities in terms of the actual structural makeup of the organism, we can also use genetics. Okay, genetics are a more reliable tool for classifying organisms. All right, so we can use genetic analysis. We can use these phylogenetic relationships to sort of trace back the lineage of this organism to try to truly identify it. Okay, so taxonomy, one of the scientists that is credited with being the father of classification is Carlos Linnaeus. You should write that name down. You've probably seen it before. Okay, he is responsible for developing this system that we use for naming and classifying organisms. Okay, we refer to this system as a binomial system of nomenclature. Okay, and again, we're looking at this, maybe a new term for you, but that term, that prefix bi means two in biology. Okay, nomenclature means name, right? So this binomial system of nomenclature is a system that we use to assign each species a two-part name. Okay, so think of it like your first and last name. Each one of us have a unique name that identifies us. Okay, organisms have this same two-part name. Okay, which tells us its genus and species. Okay, the genus is the first part of the name. The species, the specific epithet, is the second part of the name. Okay, the species is the most specific degree of classification, where pretty much all of the organisms at the species level are going to be pretty much identical. And I'll show you this schematic in just the same, but I have a couple rules that you need to know as far as using the binomial system of nomenclature to name organisms. There are some rules. Write this down. You need to know them. You will continue to have to know this as you matriculate through this program. When you are reading and looking in your textbook, or when you're writing your lab reports and so forth, you have to follow these rules. The genus, the first part of the name, think of it like your first name. The genus has to be capitalized. Write this down because you'll be tested on this information. Like if I give you a question, you need to identify which name is written correctly. The genus is capitalized. Okay, the first part of the name is capitalized. The species, the second part of the name is always in lowercase. If you write them both in capital, you're going to get the answer wrong. Okay, so the genus is capitalized, the species is lowercase. Okay, and the entire name is written in italics. On your computer, if you're writing the name of an organism for whatever reason, if you're writing about E. coli, salmonella, whatever organism you're writing about on your research term paper or whatever, you have to follow these rules. The first name is capitalized, the second name is not. The entire name is italicized if you're using a word processor, a computer. If you are handwriting your answer for whatever reason, you underline the name. Okay? If you're typing, you do not do both. If you're typing, you only italicize the name. Do not underline it. Okay? So these are some rules that you kind of need to kind of get memorized in your head. And so you will have some exam questions around this, these rules for nomenclature. What questions do we have? Any questions? Great.
I have a question.
Sure.
When you say the first part needs to be capitalized, do you mean the first letter or the entire?
Just the first letter. Like if you're writing your first name, you capitalize the first letter. Just the first letter in the first part of the name.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry for that confusion. Okay. So species. So I mentioned the species being the most similar level of organization or classification rather. All right. By definition, we're going to say a species is a group of organisms with similar structure, function, and behavior. I used humans as an example, as we most readily identify with humans. Okay. Human species, we all, for the most part, have the same structure. That means like our physical structure, like what does our body look like? Like human species are all, for the most part, gonna have 2 legs, 2 arms, 2 noses. I'm sorry, 2 eyes, 1 nose, 2 ears. You know, like structurally, we're gonna be all similar. Functionally, we're pretty much all gonna function the same. Like our bodies overall have the same functions in terms of, like I said, metabolism, cellular respiration, digestion, you know, all of these things that's going on are generally gonna happen the same in most of us, okay? Of course, there are abnormalities. Unfortunately, there are abnormalities, but for the most part, as a species, we all are going to have similar structure, function, and behavior. Now, there's one defining feature of a species that you must include when you're describing characteristics of a species, okay? A species will always consist of a group of organisms or populations whose members are capable of breeding together and producing fertile offsprings. That is a requirement for a species, for organisms to be a part of the same species. They must be able to breed together, okay? 2 members must be able to breed together and produce fertile offsprings. Write that down. Okay, so when we're defining a species, not only are we saying that these organisms or individuals in this population are going to have similar structure and function and behavior, but they must also be capable of breeding together and producing fertile offsprings. And so anyway, if we just wanted to see a visual of what we're saying a species is, this is our most inclusive or most similar level of classification. Is these butterflies right here, right? We're clear that these are all butterflies, but they all look a little different. Okay, but from the standpoint of structure, function, and so forth, they're all behaviors with just minor differences. Okay, we've got a little color variation, we've got like variations in wingspan, wing length, and so forth, and we see that amongst humans too. Structurally, we're all the same with the same number of limbs and eyes and so forth, but of course, we've got various populations where our skin tones are going to look different, our eye colors are going to be different, our hair color are going to be different, but we are of the same species as a human. All right, so species are the most specific level of classification where all of the members are pretty much going to be identical. Okay, so let's look at these categories of classification. Okay, there are 8 major categories of classification for living things. Okay, I already said that the species is the most specific level of classification. Make sure you have that in your notes. All right, if we look at this schematic right here, we're seeing that species is all the way down here at the bottom. Okay, this is our most specific category of classification. All right, as we're moving down this classification scheme, we're looking at similarities, and the similarities and features continue to increase and increase and increase till we get down to a group of individuals that are pretty much identical. Okay, but if we moved up this classification scheme backwards, right, we're going to see less and less similarities amongst the organisms at each level, right? And if we start right here at the top, the domain is the broadest level of classification. Okay, make a note of this. Our domain levels of classification are the most broad. Okay, meaning they're going to be the most inclusive, right? If any organism that we have identified or discovered and named in our binomial system of nomenclature has been assigned to one of 3 kingdoms. Write this down. There are 3 kingdoms. Okay, every single organism that we have identified is categorized into one of these 3 kingdoms. Okay, the domain kingdom the domain level of classification is based on the presence or absence of one thing, and that is a nucleus. All right, so if we just went back to the cellular organization of this organism, depending on whether or not this is a eukaryotic organism or a prokaryotic organism, is going to determine what domain we assign it to. Okay, so the presence or absence of that nucleus. Okay, so this is a very broad level of classification. And then we move down to this kingdom level. Now we're looking for a little bit more inclusion criteria. There are 5 kingdoms, right? And then as we continue to move down these classification categories, we're looking for more specific inclusion criteria. Okay, is this a mammal? Is it warm-blooded? Does it have 2 legs or 4 legs? You know, we're looking for very specific features now to continue to assign an organism to any given level of classification. Okay, but generally speaking, we're understanding as we move down this classification hierarchy, the similarities increase. Okay, when we get to the species level, these are pretty much going to be identical species. So you should definitely learn this classification hierarchy. Okay, with domain being the broadest and species being the most specific. What questions do we have about this slide?
What were you saying about 3 again? That there's 3 domains?
It's on my next slide. I kind of got ahead of myself. So right now, I just want you to paint the picture that there are 8 major classification categories. And when we look at this hierarchy from domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species, as you move down the classification scheme, you are looking for very specific inclusion criteria, and the similarities increase. Okay, so there's going to be fewer numbers of organisms at each level of classification because now we're looking for very specific features. That's what I want you to get right now. There are 8 categories of classification, and as we move down each level, we're looking for very specific features for inclusion, okay, into that category. So the domain, okay, let's look at the domain classification. There are 3 domains: domain eukarya, prokarya, and archaea. Okay, Eukarya means that these are all eukaryotic organisms. A domain bacteria or prokarya, some literature will say prokarya. These are our prokaryotic organisms. And then we have a very unique domain, Archaea, that you may not hear a whole lot about, but this is also a prokaryotic domain. Archaea are very similar to bacteria in terms of structure and so forth, but they have some physiological differences that require them to be assigned to their own domain, because they have some characteristics of survival in sort of extreme environments that doesn't support normal bacteria life, right? But we have 3 domains, write them down: domain bacteria or prokarya, domain archaea, and domain eukarya. So these are 3 domains of life. Every single organism that we have categorized will be assigned to one of these 3 domains. Write that down: prokarya, archaea, and eukarya. And this is basically due to the presence or absence of the nucleus. All right, if it's prokaryotes, eukaryotes. All right, Archaea, make sure you have written this in your notes. Archaea are prokaryotic organisms. They're basically bacteria with some different physiological features, okay, that allows them to survive in very extreme and hostile environments, okay? But structurally, they look like bacteria, okay? So that's the domain level, right? Then if we wanted to further classify organisms, we classify them based on our 5 kingdom system, okay? You've probably heard about the 5 kingdom system before, right? So you've got plants, animals, fungi, protista, and bacteria, Monera, okay? Write down those 5 kingdoms, right? Yes, 5 kingdoms: Plantae, Animaliae, fungi, protista, and Monera. That's 5 kingdoms. The Monera kingdom is where we find our bacteria. Okay, so Plantae, Animaliae, fungi, protista, and Monera. Okay, Monera is where we find our bacteria, right? Those are prokaryotes, right? So we're in our domain prokarya. Okay, all of the other 4 kingdoms are going to be eukaryotic. So fungi, animals, plants, protista, these are all eukaryotic organisms. All right, so you should definitely know this classification. Like our protista are like our protozoans, like the paramecium and euglena and so forth. You probably don't hear a whole lot about them, but they are a very important group of microorganisms also. So we have plants, animals, fungi, and protista as and Monera as our 5 kingdom system. So let me just go back over here again for those of us that are visual. If we're looking at our classification scheme, we have 3 domains, right? Prokarya, eukarya, and archaea. Okay, inclusion into one of these 3 domains is very simple, is whether or not the organism contains a nucleus or not, right? And so you've learned about the cell, and we know that some cells have these membrane-bound organelles like the mitochondria, nucleus, Golgi apparatus. That's very clear. If it's a simple cell type, we don't have those structures, and those are prokaryotes, okay? If it's a more complex cell type, we're going to find the nucleus in addition to the mitochondria and all of the other internal organelles in the cell, and those are eukaryotes. And so that's the only requirement at the domain level, okay? If we go down to the kingdom level, now we're looking for more specific inclusion criteria. We've got 5 kingdoms to consider, all right? Every organism that we have identified to this date with this binomial system of nomenclature will be assigned to one of the 5 kingdoms that we just looked at, okay? Plants, animals, fungi, protista, and Monera. There are 5 kingdoms. You need to know these 5, the 5 kingdom classification. Now, after the kingdom, things get a little tricky because the number of the number of subcategories can change depending on the organism. Okay, so the number of phyla, or divisions for plants, or the number of classes, the number of order, the number of families, the number of genus, the number of species is going to differ depending on the actual organism. Okay, so I don't think it's a great use of our time to try and remember every single number under these categories for the purpose of this class. I do want you to know the domain, the 3-domain system. I do want you to know the 5-kingdom system of classification. Okay. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. All right, so let's look at some examples here. And so again, after the kingdom, all right, the numbers are going to differ depending on the actual organism. So for the sake of this class, I want you to understand how the classification system works. All right, you're not memorizing them all at this point. I want you to know how it works. I want you to be able to use the information. So let's look at how we can use this classification scheme to identify a human. This is an example of a classification scheme all the way down for humans. All right, so we know that the domain is going to be what? What would be the domain for a human? What domain would he be classified as?
Eukarya.
Eukarya, thank you. So we're in eukarya domain because you know we are eukaryotic organisms. The kingdom is what? It's right here on this classification.
Animalia.
The kingdom is Animaliae, right? The phylum is Chordata. So again, at this point, the phyla, class, order, family, genus, and species is going to differ. The name of it is going to be different depending on the organism. Okay, I don't want you guys to panic, and I don't think for this class it's a great use of our time to try to learn every subcategory for phyla, classes, and so forth. But what I want you to understand is that there are inclusion criteria for each one of these. And so for the phylum Chordata for human, again, we're looking for very specific features. Like in this case, does it have a backbone or not? Is it a vertebrae or invertebrate? Okay, things like that. The class is Mammaliae, right? We're mammals, warm-blooded. Or order, we're primates, okay? The family, Hominidae. Genus, Homo. Species, Sapien. So if I asked you to, if I showed you this schematic on a quiz or an exam, and I ask you to determine the scientific name for this organism right here, what would you tell me is the scientific name, just with this information that's given to you? What is the scientific name of a human?
Homo sapien.
Homo sapien. How did you determine that?
The genus and species.
The genus and the species is used to determine the scientific name of an organism. And so again, for the purpose of this class, this information would be given to you, but I expect you to be able to use this information in whatever manner that I asked you. If I asked you to tell me which level of classification is the most specific here, what would you tell me?
Species.
Species.
Species, okay. All right, so let's move over here to this orca. Let's see, what is the scientific name of this organism? If I just showed you this schematic, what would be the scientific name of this organism?
Orcanus orca?
Orcinus orca. Okay, very good. Orcinus orca would be the scientific name of this organism. And again, as you can see here, we're having this organism also assigned to kingdom Animaliae, phylum Chordata, class Mammaliae. But if you look at the order here, it's going to be of a different order, okay, compared to the human, which is primates, right? So this is suggesting that this organism is in the lineage of primates for origin here, and right here is for Cetaceae. All right, so again, I I refuse to make you memorize all of the different phyla or divisions and classes in order. I don't think that's a good use of our time for this class. You may do it in some other classes that you take in vertebrate or zoology or something like that. But I do want you to be able to use the information and understand what the information is telling you in regards to classification. Okay? All right. What questions do we have? We're going to stop here today.